Here to talk about some trade union things and what has been going on in the news lately. I'll say lately, in the last couple of days, it's been quite interesting, besides what's been happening over the pond as well. But just a few housekeeping rules as we usually do things over these video calls is for everyone to mic themselves. We don't want random phone calls or video programs, whatever going on in the background. And also for those who want to answer questions and give questions to the speakers today, can you please privately message me on the to me, please? You can do that by basically clicking on the arrow next to everyone and then just select my name, and then you can send me the questions there and I'll just collate them up and then we can give them all at the end. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to talk to our 4 speakers today. So we've got Allison Roche, the National Policy Officer at UNISON. We've got Ruth Bergan, the Senior Advisor at the Trade Justice Movement. We've got Nick Dearden, the Director at Global Justice Now, and Emily Jones, a political economist at the University of Oxford. Welcome, everyone. So we're going to kick off the evening with Ruth. So Ruth, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Kavinti, and thanks for the invite to come and speak. And it's nice to see a few old colleagues in the audience. So yeah, good to be here. I'm just going to try and paint a bit of a picture of the situation in terms of the EU deal. So just some overview points, what the deal looks like in terms of things that we've been concerned about over the past 4 years. And then just a picture of kind of how things could have been different had the political situation not been as it was. So I think just some points worth remembering. These will be familiar to most of you, but I think it does bear restating. The deal with the EU is the single biggest trade agreement that we will negotiate. It's much bigger than the deal with the US, and I think that sort of got lost in a lot of the media debate. So a deal with the EU is 45% of our total trade. So as much as many politicians would like to say, well, it's a declining share, it's still more than 20% above the next closest trading partner, which is the US. We're also, so we're closest, they're our closest trading ally in terms of kind of size of trade, also geographically, which matters in terms of where your trade goes to, but also in terms of alignment, in terms of regulation and standards. And we may be critical of where the EU has got to in terms of their standards, but they tend to be a lot higher than a lot of our other partners. So that's a really significant kind of part of the picture when you're looking at who you're negotiating with. And another thing that is worth remembering is that this deal was negotiated by the Cabinet Office under Michael Gove, not by the Department for International Trade, which is where the rest of the UK's trade deals will be negotiated. And what that meant was, and I think Emily's going to talk more about this, was that there was absolutely no input into that deal from trade unions, from us as civil society organisations, from academics. I think even businesses have been telling us that they struggled to access. So it's a deal negotiated without any reference to what business wanted, what civil society wanted, what trade unions wanted. The Department for International Trade isn't a lot better, but there is some infrastructure there. So we are part of a thematic working group and we meet with civil servants. We can talk to them. We have been involved in meetings with ministers, and other civil society colleagues do get kind of discussions with ministers, although there's lots of issues with what happens after that. In terms of what the trade deal looks like, it's a lot like the other deals that we've seen negotiated by the EU and that have now been rolled over into UK law. And the UK has also negotiated some new deals with countries like Kenya, Ghana, and Cote d'Ivoire. And what I mean by that is the emphasis, it's all about trade liberalisation. So the thrust of it is you liberalise trade, that generates growth, that creates jobs. And also, I mean, if you follow some of what comes out of say the WTO, but also the think tanks that are influencing government policy at the moment, trade liberalisation and growth is the answer to everything. It'll solve your environmental problems, it'll improve workers' rights, it'll tick all of your boxes. So that's the kind of logic behind these trade deals, and that's what's driving the deal with the EU. And the deal covers not just tariffs. We heard lots about tariffs. So, and those are ongoing issues in terms of kind of how to apply tariffs, how to check what tariff is applicable to your particular product, depending on where it was made. The deal will also cover things like regulation, access to procurement markets, intellectual property. So what protection do you have for patents and so on? And in many ways, when we talk about trade deals, something that we kind of tend towards is to say, well, look, in terms of what most people think of when they think of trade, these aren't really trade deals anymore. They've turned into something much more like a sort of global manifesto for liberalization and globalization. The last thing that I think it's worth mentioning about this trade deal and all the other trade deals that are in the pipeline is there's currently no strategy from the government. So no explicit strategy that says what they want to achieve with their trade and how they're going to do that. So we did have a white paper back in 2017, but Johnson scrapped it. So there's nothing that says, well, this is what the government's trying to achieve with this trade negotiations, trade policy, and this is how they're going to get there. And what seems to be happening is they're just trying to get through as many deals as they can. And a number of colleagues have pointed out that apart from anything else, apart from nothing that says how this is contributing to things like their climate commitments, it's also leading to quite a number of contradictions within trade deals. And Allison might talk more about the digital aspect of that. So quite a lot to kind of keep watching. So we were watching the negotiations as far as we were able to, and we developed some red lines in terms of what we wanted to see. So I just wanted to kind of briefly touch on how we rated them against kind of what we were hoping for. You might have been aware that there was quite a lot of discussion around standards and a level playing field. So lots of our colleagues in the green movement were keen to maintain a level playing field and non-regression. And in the end, actually, the deal falls quite a long way from that. So there were some elements of the level playing field that the EU was proposing, but it's not as extensive as the EU had initially called for. So what that means is that at the moment, if you backtrack on standards, existing standards, or you diverge in future, you can only be challenged if the EU can demonstrate that it had an impact on trade and investment. And I'll explain later, but that it's quite difficult to demonstrate that. So it's a really high bar for taking action, and it leaves lots of space for the UK to deregulate. There is some enforceability when it comes to specific non-regression commitments. And how that works is you take it to a panel of experts, they produce a report, and what's different about this deal as compared with other deals is you can invoke temporary remedies. So it means you can actually do something in response to issues that you've raised. And it does apply to labour and social standards, the environment and climate. Anything not covered by specific non-regression commitments doesn't have that level of enforceability. And you end with a process where you get a report from a panel and everyone says how nice, and nothing much happens after that. There is also then in addition a provision that says you can have a rebalancing, you can take rebalancing actions if in future the two parties diverge too far, but again you have to demonstrate a negative impact on trade and investment, which is very high. And specifically, you have to provide reliable evidence of a material impact on trade and investment, which is pretty tough. And also your retaliation measures have to be limited in scope and duration. The government will try to claim that this deal is great for climate change and entirely innovative. It builds on some work that's been done in the Netherlands and France that ended up in it's called a non-paper at the EU, which has kind of moved things on a little bit. So climate change is referred to as an essential element of a deal that puts it on a par with democracy, the rule of law, human rights, and countering the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. That is quite significant in terms of status. It's also then covered by dispute settlement, but again, the bar's quite high for actually doing anything about it. There has to be serious and some substantial failure by the other party, and if you can demonstrate that, then you can take action. but it is a very high bar for action. And all of the other environmental commitments, as with all of the trade deals, have no enforceability. So commitments around CITES or other multilateral environmental agreements are effectively not enforceable, as are the labour clauses. So for us, this was a huge missed opportunity. Because of the existing close alignment, we thought it was possible that this trade deal could actually do something quite different and could be better aligned with our kind of commitments around things like climate change and ILO commitments. One of the ways that could have been achieved is through a decent process of scrutiny and stakeholder engagement, not just the week that parliamentarians were given to look at the couple of thousand pages of deal. And I mean, parliamentarians were left in a position of having to either vote for a deal that they barely had time to read, or opting for no deal, which is you know, just a Hobson's choice. We worked with colleagues, including UNISON and Global Justice Now, to try and develop what we thought might be a kind of workable alternative. And I mean, it responds to a challenge that we often face, which is, well, if you don't like all of these trade deals, you know, TTIP, economic partnership agreements and so on, you know, what is it that you do want? So we felt that in terms of a deal, since no deal looked like such a bad option, we felt this was our chance to say, well, look, in this context, here's what we'd like to see. But just to give you kind of a couple of the things that it did, it took out a lot of the most damaging provisions that we find in ordinary trade agreements. So public services not covered by trade, regulatory cooperation to be dealt with outside of trade agreements, investor protection. So that's the system that allows investors to sue countries for damages if they don't like a policy decision. We took that out of a trade agreement. And the logic for that is that actually, if you want regulatory cooperation, all well and good, but do it in a forum that's not all about whether or not your regulations increase trade. Do it in a forum that says, we are collectively looking to improve regulation on labour, on the environment, on climate. And the second thing that we tried to do was sort of put trade in its box. So I think if you look at trade agreements, they're binding and enforceable. If you look at multilateral environmental agreements or ILO agreements, they're not binding or enforceable. And so we kind of in general feel that trade agreements need to be put back in their box and be kind of set alongside it in a much more equal status to other agreements, and should be subordinate to things like agreements around climate change and labour rights. So you then have explicit kind of provisions that say trade agreements are subordinate to all of these other agreements. And then you can move on to, well, what do you actually need in your trade agreement? In terms of the EU, we included things like zero tariffs, but with some flexibility so that you could respond to changes, negative changes in standards. Some services, but not public services. So things like logistics and accountancy, we felt, you know, well, okay, if you want to kind of trade internationally, that's probably not going to cause lots of kind of damaging consequences. And also to treat them in a way that doesn't normally happen in trade agreements. It's a bit technical, but it's a positive list instead of a negative list. So a positive list is where you actively choose what you want to include on the list. Negative list means everything's in unless you actually said you don't want it in, which can lead to lots of kind of confusion and unintended consequences. So, okay, I'm going to stop there. I hope that was kind of clear. It was a bit of a romp through all of the things that we've done, but I'm happy to answer questions later. Thanks.
Thank you for that insight. Next up on the list, in the order is Allison.
Yes, thanks, Chair, and also thanks for the invite. Yeah, I'm the policy lead for UNISON on Brexit, and I have been leading on it since we had the referendum back in June 2016, believe it or not. So it's actually been, you know, a journey really, and quite a significant journey around my understanding and building alliances around trade deals. And I'm really glad to have shared that experience with some of the people here on the panel, because it's strengthened our movement really to have understood what the implications are post-Brexit for future trade deals. I was just going to focus on three things that post-Brexit, what UNISON, for example, will be prioritising. One is the workers' rights, what the Brexit deal means for those in the future. The second one I'm going to talk about is public procurement, because that's the outsourcing of all our public services and how that can impact on workers' rights. And the third one is looking at digital rights through the eyes of workers in the UK and what Brexit means in relation to that. I'm going to try and avoid getting too detailed and too technical. So if there's anything you're not sure about what I'm talking about, then again, just ask. But first of all, I was going to say that the deal is really bad for working people. It's actually the first deal in history where they've actually increased barriers rather than lowered them or removed them. And that increase in barriers translates at the end of the day that someone's going to have to pay for the fact it's going to be more costly to trade, whether you're trading in goods or in the services in the future. So that's the first thing that UNISON, we had a meeting last week, that's our message on behalf of working people. It's not a good deal. If we look at workers' rights, what we find is that the deal attempts very poorly to protect two things. One is where the level playing field, whatever we had on December the 31st in terms of workers' rights, wasn't allowed to fall after the deal. So in other words, non-regression. The second thing the deal attempts to do is say in the future, we want to maintain some alignment, again, so that the UK doesn't diverge away from what we had. But unfortunately, the way that the deal attempts to say to protect these two things, non-regression, non-divergence, is that you have to prove that there has been some non-regression or divergence. You have to provide evidence. You have to put this evidence together and then take it to some sort of panel of experts, if you like, on both sides. And the only way that you can measure whether there's been non-regression or non-divergence is whether it's had a negative impact on the trade or financial investment that has been enabled through the trade deal. It's a complete get-out clause for business only, really. And it doesn't defend us as a trade union saying that our workers now have lost to pay or whatever. So the protection clause really isn't worth anything. Not only is it going to be really difficult to prove that workers' rights have been weakened, but it's also going to be really time consuming. And these arbitration panels or whatever can take years and years. And so by that time, the world's moved on. So we're not really having much faith in people going to use this process, really. So that is a missed opportunity. Not only have we lost those protections that we were hoping to get through the trade cooperation agreement, the Brexit deal. Before that, the government had already decided it was going to weaken those rights through a different route. And back in summer, it did a consultation saying that they wanted all the courts in England to be allowed to hear cases where business or whoever wanted to challenge past ECJ case law. So for workers, that meant if you had won a case up in the European Court of Justice, because UNISON had taken it all the way up there, it can now be challenged here in the UK saying, well, we're not part of the ECJ anymore. Is this still relevant? So basically, we're worried that big business can now also take all that case law we've won and unpick it and unravel it, weakening and making it much more difficult for those legal protections. And we think the government is not, and business isn't going to suddenly say, right, we want to get rid of all this. They're just going to slowly chip away and by stealth weaken those rights. And they'll be very clever about it. The rights we know that are very much susceptible is to pay, which is when you are protected with your terms and conditions and wages. For example, if one private company moves you from a contract into another private country, but you're running a public service, for example, the 48 hours, we've heard rumours about that might be weakened. Holiday pay, we think will be weakened. We're looking at the right for companies for workers to be consulted if there's a change in restructuring, for example, or redundancies. We think those are going to be very vulnerable in terms of what the government might do. We also think it's not just going to be about removing these rights or weakening them. There's a whole complexity around what types of laws are allowed to be looked at under judicial review, but also tribunals themselves. We're worried that the government, for example, will put a cap on what you're entitled to in terms of past cases where you might say have a long time limit to get your evidence. They might narrow that time limit so you've got less time to prepare a case or a deadline to get it kick-started. The human rights, we know they're looking at human rights. They're not attempting at the moment to get rid of human rights. What they're attempting to do is make it much harder for human rights to be challenged legally. And that's what we think they will do with employment rights. So there are much more clever ways of actually attacking and undermining workers' rights than just using a blunt hammer to weaken or get rid of them. So we also think that our concern is that with these rights, the next thing is we don't have the ECJ to protect us and we don't have European agencies anymore to protect us. What we will now have to rely on in the UK is labour investigations, labour protections, and we look currently at what we've got and there's very little that actively enforces violations of workers' rights, not just workers' rights, lots of different rights, because it's not just going to be workers' rights, it's going to be environmental rights. So we've got a task here to basically push the government to set up a workable system that A, is going to work with employers to explain to them what their rights are, B, enforce them, and C, sanction employers if they break them. And that means that we want to see mandatory codes, not voluntary, because voluntary never ever works. So we've got a lot of work domestically to do and enforce that. We also think that if we look at the complaints procedures from the fallout from this deal, any individual could actually go to the ECJ with their individual complaint about anything that they thought had been broken, whether it's environmental, social. The individual has no right in this deal to complain about what the UK government could be doing. The only group that have got rights, one is people who are looking at social benefits, that's very complicated, and pensions, they will have individual rights, and there is going to be a separate court there. But for workers' rights, no union can now go to this arbitration. It's only going to be business. And that's something else that we want to push back at. The voice we've been given are these domestic advisory groups or civil forums, which again, we're looking into at the moment and talking to ministers about what representation will be on there. But they're not going to have teeth and they're not going to be enforceable. So we've got quite a lot of work to do. I'll just finish very quickly because I know we've got the speakers. In terms of public procurement, we now are going to set up our own UK public procurement. It's very complicated public procurement, but the government has produced a green paper of 82 pages claiming that it consulted over 500 stakeholders. Well, blow me, I wrote to the TUC, I spoke to the TUC and said, were you consulted with these 500 stakeholders? No. Was any trade union? No. So surprise, surprise, trade unions were not involved of any of this stakeholder engagement. They then said that they talked to these expert international public procurement. I asked our European trade unions and the ETUC, were you consulted? No. And what is strange about all that is that public procurement, the European rules were actually the best and the highest protections for workers, environment in the world. So it's strange how the government hasn't consulted people who've been running these expert regulations for years. So who have they spoken to? So we've put a real big complaint about the absence of trade unions. If you think the TUC represents 7 million workers' voice, that is a big gap. But the big thing about the public procurement regs, and why I'm mentioning it just quickly, is on the 82 pages, it doesn't mention workers' rights, collective bargaining, environmental rights in any of its explanations of how we're going to have this great public procurement of nearly £300 billion in contracts going to private business to promote things that we want in the community, like green recovery, for example. It literally is going to basically say that every local authority has a duty, and they're going to put it in law, to promote small businesses through public procurement. Nothing about workers or anything, nothing about 0-hour contracts, nothing about the living wage or anything like that. It really has changed the narrative around how now everything's going to be for business. I was sat in another meeting this week with the TUC on this new green task force of 2 million green jobs, exactly the same. No money going to public services to help deliver the green recovery. The money is going to go to fossil private companies to train them, our public money, when it should be private business. So what we're picking up post-Brexit is that workers are marginalised and so will public services. It's all going to be about business, which will just come to my last point, which I'll finish on. When we look at digital rights, we've got GDPR rights which protect workers. And the thing I'm thinking of at the moment is this push for immunity vaccines, for example, where workers might be able to say, if you haven't got the vaccine and you can't show us, then you're not coming into work. That's going to lead into all sorts of digital rights around what your human rights are, but also because health rights of workers are protected under EU law and under human rights law. If we're going to rip that up, then you're going to end up discriminating through the lack of digital protection in the workplace. For BME are at the moment less likely to want to take the vaccine, and it could be that BME workers get discriminated because of these lack of rights the government's going to bring in. So it's a huge big thing that we battle for workers' rights, and it's going to be an interesting year. And I must say the trade union, the TUC, we have had some great meetings and we've got some good ideas. We're going to have a digital manifesto for workers' rights and push the government back. So anyway, I'll leave it there. Thank you, Convened.
Okay, thank you for that. Next up is Emily.
Thank you very much. It's a real privilege to be with you all this evening. So I'm Emily Jones. I'm an associate professor at the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford. So very much coming at this from a trade policy perspective. And I wanted to make comment on three different areas today. First, I'll make some just overall comments on I think where we're at and why the trade policy matters. I'll then talk, colleagues have already mentioned this question about consultation or lack thereof, which I'll build on, and also talk about the lack of parliamentary scrutiny, because I think that's particularly important for us all. And then I'll just briefly mention some of the things about digital trade, because I think that's an area that often gets neglected and perhaps we all need to pay a little bit more attention to. So I think Ruth gave us a really good overview there of the EU UK trade agreement, which of course, as she said, is exactly the most important one. But just to situate that within what else the UK is doing, so it's also rolled over all the old trade agreements that we were party to when we were part of the EU. So the EU had a lot of free trade agreements with third countries, and so we've sort of rolled them over. Most of them, they didn't change very much. But for example, and I'll come back to this, the deal that we did with Japan did have new commitments in. Then, of course, the second element is the EU, the new trade agreement we've just negotiated and concluded with the EU, by far the most important. And then the third category, and I know Nick's going to speak to this, are the new agreements, in particular with the United States, but also we're negotiating trade agreements with Australia, New Zealand, possibly with Singapore. There's also, at the WTO, we're also active there. So there's a whole range of areas where the UK government is active on trade policy. And just to underscore what others have said, I think we often think about trade policy and trade deals as opening up our economies. And of course, they still do that in many ways, but they're also about how we regulate the economy. And what's really important to understand, and they've changed so much from sort of 50 years ago, where we were really talking about tariffs at the border and knocking them down so that we could have more trade. This is really now about how we regulate the economy. Colleagues have mentioned, but just the number of areas that are covered now in a trade agreement and the number of policy areas they touch on. We of course can think about agriculture, food standards, the chlorine washed chicken, we're all aware of those debates, but the services, so public services, Allison's spoken to, and investment, intellectual property, so things like medicine patents, protection of technology, government procurement, again Allison's mentioned, customs and trade facilitation, environment and labour, the health policies, and health is also in there. So there's a lot of areas of domestic public policy that are affected. So I think we've got to bear in mind how broad trade agreements are. They're typically now more than 1,000 pages of dense legal text. They're also international treaties, right? So they're hard to change. So we really need to get it right. And just thinking about where we're at in the UK now, we're a large, prosperous economy, right? But we've also got very serious problems that I think have already been mentioned in terms of workers' rights. But we have incredibly high levels of inequality, particularly spatial inequality. If you think of regional inequalities geographically in the UK, sort of between London and other parts of the UK and other regions, there's some of the highest levels of inequality of any OECD country. Levels of in-work poverty, if you just think of food banks and children living in poverty, and of course we've got the climate crisis to contend to and the need to transition to a green economy. So there's a huge economic agenda in front of us, and if we're not careful, I think we've got trade agreements can actually derail that. Done effectively, I think they're going to support it. If we're not careful, they're going to lock in a set of international obligations that they're actually going to make that agenda harder. And I think that's why we all need to be abreast of them. However dense and technical the discussion can become, actually at the end of the day, there are really important public policy issues at stake. Of course, given that, it's really important that we have very careful, considered decision making, open discussion, making sure that all stakeholders, business, and they're not thinking only about large business, but smaller businesses as well, but also obviously trade unions and workers, civil society, citizens' rights groups. Because there's such a wide set of issues at stake, really, really important to get the consultation right. And I'm going to speak quite a bit about this, parliamentary scrutiny. And there, I'm afraid at the moment, we've got a very weak process indeed. So just to say a few more words about the scrutiny processes, we've got, as Ruth has explained, the trade agreement with the EU was negotiated not by the Department of International Trade and with very little consultation and very little oversight. It is a little bit better with the Department of Trade with these different trade advisory groups, but there's a lot of concerns that they're not inclusive, so they're sort of siloed. Most of them are business only, and they've now, after quite a lot of lobbying, I think, got a trade union advisory group. But the issue is that at the moment there's no proper multi-stakeholder platform where everyone who's concerned about a specific sector can actually get together and discuss all the issues. So there's a real, I think, a sidelining actually at the moment of non-business voices. And what's striking is even when you talk to the business community, a lot of them don't feel like their voices are being heard either. So there's a real issue of a lack of input and proper consultation. The quality of information in the public domain, but also even in those type of consultative groups, is really poor. So a lot of advisory groups aren't getting to see the texts, they're not being properly consulted. So there's a lot of feeling that they're sort of rubber stamping mechanisms. And they're there more for show than they are for proper consultation, including, as I say, with business, which is quite striking. So it's really not a two-way dialogue of stakeholders giving input and feeding in their advice. There's very little genuine dialogue, I think, going on at the moment. And then parliamentary scrutiny, and this is what I'll spend most of my time talking about, is surprisingly weak. So I've worked for quite a long time on EU and United States trade agreements. And when I started working on the UK trade agreement and trying to understand exactly what the process is for Parliament to scrutinise these trade agreements that we're now negotiating, I was genuinely shocked and surprised at how weak Parliament's oversight role is and how weak it is compared to the European Parliament or Congress, so the United States Congress. And just to give you a bit of a sense of how the UK setup is and how it differs and why that really matters. So in the UK, we have a real marked difference between how our parliamentary oversight of domestic and foreign policy. Okay, so foreign policy, including the right to enter into international treaties like trade agreements, comes under what's known as the royal prerogative. Okay, and that's it sits with the executive. So it's the executive branch of government. And what's crucially important there is that Parliament really doesn't have much of a say. Okay, and it's been like that since the 1800s, and it hasn't really changed. And there was the original justification for that was to say, well, if we're at war, matters of war and peace shouldn't be endlessly debated in Parliament. So let the executive branch of government have a lot of free rein in that realm, and to get Parliament overly involved would cause problems for the executive. Maybe that was a good argument 200 years ago, but for things like trade agreements now, with the vast number of public policy issues at stake, it really doesn't hold to have so little scrutiny by Parliament of international trade agreements, but have a much more detailed process for domestic policy. So, i.e., this sort of this difference, if you like, in the way that Parliament oversees domestic and foreign affairs, really, I don't think holds for the 21st century for the type of agreements we've got. And just give you a bit of a sense of what then the powers of Parliament are. So UK treaty scrutiny happens under or is governed by what's called the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act, which is a 2010 act. And it's got really quite serious weaknesses. So in terms of formal rights, our MPs at the moment have no formal right to have an input into the negotiating objectives. So when Nick talks about the United States trade negotiation, which is going to be really important in terms of these big decisions about how the economy is regulated, our MPs have no formal right into the negotiating objectives, i.e. to influence what the government negotiates, which is stark contrast to the United States, where it's set in legislation and they decide, the congressional representatives, what the executive branch goes out and negotiates. And similarly in the EU, it's not quite as strong a right formally, but European Parliament certainly sets the parameters of what the European Commission, or influences the parameters of what the European Commission does. So that's at the beginning of the process. During the negotiations, the US Congress and the European Parliament, the parliamentarians get to see the confidential texts, right? So they can actually see what's our executive negotiating on our behalf, and they can sort of hold the executive to account. So in the EU, it's a little bit more public than in the US, but from the point of view of the legislature, the parliamentarians or the congressional representatives, they've got a lot of oversight. In the UK, no formal rights at all. Okay, so in practice, our MPs have absolutely no oversight as to what's actually happening in those negotiating rooms. And then at the end, there's no guarantee of a debate or a vote. Okay, so at the moment, the government has in practice brought these treaties to the House, but there's no guarantee that our parliamentarians will be able to debate or vote. And even where they do, there's the limited time for scrutiny. So at the moment, there's only 21 sitting days that they have to scrutinise trade agreements. And of course, in the case of the really important agreement that we're all discussing tonight with the EU, it was tabled in Christmas Eve, and they had to they give their assent within a few days, right? So again, that debate and vote, essentially they didn't have a choice but to just nod it through. And what's really interesting there is that the European Parliament has been given, it's been applied provisionally by the EU, and the European Parliament right now is scrutinising that agreement and will have input. Our parliamentarians, not only has the agreement been ratified, or is being ratified now, so they've got no formal role again, but at the same time, the EU, the committee, as I understand, within the House of Commons is now being closed. Okay, so they were going to do a post-ratification scrutiny over the next 6 months, and now that process looks like it's not going to happen at all. So incredibly little scrutiny. And again, if you just look at what happens in the United States, the EU, or even Japan, parliamentarians or the legislative branch have so much more oversight and ability to sort of vote up or down an agreement. So the government, I think the colleagues have alluded to the scrutiny amendment that went through, or didn't go through rather, that was debated in the House of Commons earlier this week. So this is about the trade bill, and it's been debated back and forth over the last 2 years, I think, Ruth, something like that. So it's been going 4 years, there you go, back and forth, and the House of Lords managed to put in quite a robust scrutiny amendment, which would have allowed our MPs to have the kind of rights that US Congress or European Parliament have, but if you followed, they didn't get that amendment through. It's now gone back to the House of Lords, and there's a chance that we will see in early February a scrutiny agreement or a scrutiny amendment come back again in early February. So again, if anyone's got time to write to their MPs and just to explain how important this is, I think it's well worth doing. Because with all of what we're discussing, if Parliament and our MPs can't have oversight and information, we've really got a problem in terms of holding the government to account. And I genuinely think we're going to have better policy making if we can hold the government to account and if it's much more democratically done. Just very briefly on digital trade, I just think it's something that often when we talk about trade, we think about agriculture or we think about industry, and the digital economy and the way that we regulate the digital economy is increasingly important. And Allison mentioned there sort of data and data protection, but also trade agreements now. There's a lot of provisions that are about internet regulation, platform liability, the regulation of digital technologies, so for example, algorithms. And I'm happy to talk more about that, but just to say that's another area I think all of us need to understand better and ask questions of our representatives and of our government. So main message I think to all of us tonight is just to stay engaged. It can get really dry, it can get really technical, but it matters.
Thank you, Emily. Finally, we've got Nick Kim.
Thanks very much. And what I want to try and do is take a bit of a look about where all this is going to, like what the final project is here. At the moment, we can see enormous problems at the ports. We can see huge problems with people trying to buy stuff from the EU, problems with getting hold of Percy pigs in Marks and Spencers and whatnot. So this is all in the newspapers every day. And I think there's a tendency for people to say, this is more incompetence from this government. And I want to question that a bit, really. I'm not saying the government isn't incompetent. They clearly are in all sorts of ways. But actually, I think what you're seeing now is not accidental or incompetent. It's part of the project that the Brexiteers set themselves on, not even 4 years ago, but a couple of decades ago. Brexit for Boris Johnson and some of those around him was a way to rid Britain of the regulations, protections and standards that have been built up through our membership of the EU over decades. I mean, it's almost laughable to those of us that campaign around some of the policies of the EU and have done for a long time. But for Johnson and his cohort, I mean, they almost see the EU as some kind of protectionist, semi-communist conspiracy that they're just desperate to get out of and have always been desperate not to be part of, so that they can kind of unleash this bonfire of regulation and allow British entrepreneurship to dominate the world. And so what you're seeing now, I believe, has been costed in to that project. You can't have the kind of change that they're looking for to this country without some cost, and we're seeing that cost now, and the cost is going to be felt by workers, by consumers, by our environment over the next few years. In the negotiating process, we heard a lot of stuff about fish. I don't think they were particularly interested in fish, and you can already see from the lorries of fish that were driven down to Downing Street yesterday that if they were, they'd singularly failed to protect the fisherfolk of this country. What they were really interested in is divergence, and we did hear that word quite a bit as well. And the right to diverge from EU rules, and by divergence, they mean deregulation, as far as I can see, and they can do that now, and the consequences of that, as I say, are certainly going to be very disruptive, are going to be very difficult for people, but as far as I can see, they've built that in. So the idea, I mean, I've been talking to a lot of people over the last couple of weeks about what's going to happen, and a lot of people are saying, oh, it's just too chaotic and they've made a mess here and they're going to have to renegotiate. I personally don't think there's any chance of that from this government at all. I think this has all been entirely factored in and is all kind of where they're going. They have a long-term vision, and their long-term vision is a 20-year project to reorient this country's political system, economic system, indeed our very culture, away from Europe and towards other parts of the world where they think their kind of ideological bent towards free markets and so on will have more traction. So unless things get really, really, really bad, I don't think that's anything like a renegotiation is on the table. And indeed, you can see that they've already started the process. So we've seen already in the last 2 or 3 weeks a number of really worrying initiatives. I'm sure people on this call will have seen the workers' rights, the discussions around workers' rights and leaving the working time directive that was on the front of the FT a few days ago. But there's loads of other stuff too. A few days before that, Rishi Sunak was talking about Big Bang 2.0, okay, referring back to Thatcher's massive deregulation of the financial markets that made this country so financialized and gave finance so much power over our economy. He's talking about that again, Big Bang 2.0. We now have the ability ability to deregulate hedge fund rules and all this kind of thing. There is already a consultation out on genetic modification, talking about changing the rules, particularly around gene editing. There's already been an emergency authorization of use of these chemicals that are so harmful for bees that Friends of the Earth and others have been campaigning against in recent years. So they're getting this underway already. You can begin to see just how broad this is, just how much of a prize they really saw this divergence or ability to deregulate and leave the EU was for these Brexiteers. And I don't know if people saw quite an incredible piece by Daniel Hannan, our former MEP, who's now officially a trade advisor is officially now an advisor to the Board of Trade, calling for deregulation of, yes, workers' rights, rules governing hedge funds and the financial sector, of consumer standards and protections. I mean, the whole lot. So this for me is quite clearly the project they're engaged in. And how are they going to do this? Well, as Emily's, I think, has already alluded to, the key mechanism that they would like to employ wherever they can is the signing of trade deals, because exactly as the other speakers have said, trade deals are so broad these days. They're so, I mean, deregulation and liberalization is hardwired into them. So if you put it, and of course, as Emily said as well, it has these two wonderful elements, which first of all, they avoid parliamentary and public scrutiny in a way that a normal bill going through Parliament would. Secondly, they carry the weight of international law once they're signed. I mean, it is possible to get out of these deals, but it's a lot more difficult than simply overturning a piece of legislation. So they're kind of ideal, really. And it's no surprise, I think, that the jewel in the crown of Brexit for Johnson was a trade deal with the US. Why? Because the US absolutely encapsulates the kind of market knows best philosophy that they would like to see implemented in this country. So extremely weak regulatory systems, big business basically being allowed to do pretty much what it wants in all sorts of different sectors. A trade deal with the US could absolutely lock us in to that kind of market-driven, deregulated and liberalized economy. And that's what they want. Now, that's not going to, in the short term, replace the trade we lose with the EU. There's absolutely no chance of that, as everybody said. But again, I really don't think that's the point of what they're trying to do here. It's a long-term vision, which is almost about rewiring the British brain, rewiring, where we choose to go on holiday, who we choose to do business with. And in that way, they hope that we will start adopting the standards of places like the US that are far more deregulated than the EU. Very quickly on where the US trade deal is. So yeah, as I think chlorine chickens has already been mentioned, that's good. Chlorine chickens are synonymous with the US trade deal. I'm sure you all know a little bit about it, but why? Because modern trade deals, particularly between rich countries like Britain and the United States, are far more to do with non-tariff barriers than tariff barriers. And a non-tariff barrier is basically any protection, standard or regulation that gets in the way of the free flow of goods, services and capital around the world. If you are a US chicken farmer, chickens are made in horrible conditions that I won't go into. I'm sure some people will want their tea after this meeting, as is much meat. It's reared in really appalling conditions in the US with lots of chemicals, GM and so forth. But if I'm a chicken farmer, my government is going to do a deal with the British. I say, well, the British have got all these awful standards that keep my products out of their markets. That's not free trade. I want you to make sure you negotiate in this free trade deal to see my chickens as equivalent. Use the word equivalent to British chickens, which means they might not be reared in the same way, but they kind of taste the same and of the same quality and so on, and so that they can be allowed in. It doesn't mean that we would immediately change our laws on how chicken could be produced in this country, but what it does mean is anyone producing chicken in this country is suddenly competing with chickens that are made to much lower standards. And so what do? You can maybe find a few niche markets that you can sell better quality organic chicken to, but by and large, you either go out of business or you lobby your own government to reduce standards. And that is how modern trade deals apply this kind of race to the bottom. The EU as a bloc was actually a bit different. It was by no means perfect in terms of its trade policy, but because of the other elements of the EU, the political, the kind of democratic elements and so on, it at least meant that actually over time, standards tended to rise in many areas, not all, but in many areas. But in a normal free trade agreement, that's unlikely to happen for exactly that reason. You are suddenly competing with wherever things are produced to the lowest possible standard. And that is replicated throughout society. So a US trade deal really is not, it's not even particularly about trading more. There's a wonderful campaigner we work with in the United States called Sharon Treat. She's all about trying to improve the American regulatory system. And she says, look, what you're getting from a US trade deal is not really more trade with the US or simply buying more US products. It is importing the US regulatory system into Britain. And that, for Johnson, is precisely the prize. That's precisely what he wants out of a US trade deal. Now, where is it? We have a slightly more competent, pleasant and sane president in the United States now after yesterday, so that's positive. However, you know, you've got to remember that these trade interests are not driven particularly by the president. They are driven by big business interests in the country. Obama was negotiating the TTIP deal that through popular power on the streets, we managed to stop, but it looked very similar to what we're worried about in a US trade deal. So do not assume that a trade deal with Biden would be much better. I mean, they might have some nice words about climate in it and so on, but essentially it's the same deregulatory deal. The benefit is that Biden does not particularly see an interest in doing a deal with Boris Johnson in the way Trump did. I mean, Trump loved it because he hates the EU. He sees that as the big, along with China, as the big economic competitors to America. Weaken it in any way you can. If you can pull Britain out of the orbit of the EU and into America's orbit, fantastic. So he saw a kind of geopolitical reason for doing it. Biden doesn't. He wants to mend fences with the EU. He doesn't particularly like Boris Johnson, by all accounts, and frankly, he's got plenty on his plate to do without these trade talks. However, they are significantly far along that there is the concern that Biden could just say, okay, get it through Congress. He's going to be under pressure from big business interests. He's going to be under pressure from certain Congress people. Just get it through. Who knows? And we don't know, and we're not going to know for a few weeks yet. But it's important not to, you know, put our placards away and stop the campaign emails and so on. This may be a really serious thing that's still on the table. I think even if it isn't, there are going to be a number of trade deals that we need to fight. Now, there are some that, you know, we just don't have the capacity to fight every trade deal in the world, even though I think most of them will be deregulatory, to be perfectly honest, even ones with Australia, New Zealand and Canada. But there is one that I would like to put on into your minds, and that's the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Brexit can obviously work miracles because it can even turn us into a Pacific island state. Liz Truss is very, very seriously talking in the next few weeks of asking to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The TPP is just such a deregulatory deal as the one that we were talking about with the US. Lots of problems in it, including this awful corporate court system that allows businesses overseas to sue a government for doing pretty much anything they don't like in a special secret tribunal, and they very often win there. That's a real danger to us, and it's a real danger to anyone who does a trade deal with us, because our businesses like using these kind of corporate courts. So I think the Trans-Pacific Partnership, if the US deal has gone, is the one that we will probably want to focus on in coming years. Very finally, this is all very scary. I just want to say just a few words to kind of cheer people up, really, because I still think, despite the fact that those of us who've been fighting against Brexit for quite a long time now and are probably feeling a bit defeated by the whole process, kind of have every right to be pessimistic, but there's some really interesting things that point in the other direction. And the main one for me is this: Boris Johnson and co managed to create a coalition around Brexit made up of quite different interests, actually. And some of those interests, some of the people, especially along the Red Wall, who voted for Brexit, did not vote for his idea of a kind of deregulatory free trade Britain. They voted in many cases for the very opposite of that. So there was some research done yesterday that came out by a group called Unchecked. It's done some very detailed focus groups with Red Wall voters, swing voters in the Red Wall who voted for Brexit. And it points out again and again and again, people love standards, protections and regulation, and they don't like big business. They've got some reactionary views on other issues, no question about it. But on this issue, they absolutely hate everything that the US trade deal is. And I think it's because of that you've seen farmers all around the country protesting against the US trade deal, you know, tractors out in local towns and so on, making a nuisance of themselves to their MPs in the Tory shires. You've even had the Daily Mail writing regular commentaries against the US trade deal. So on this particular issue, on Johnson's vision of where Brexit is going next, I think we have every hope of achieving the progressive majority that we've been unable to achieve in the last few years. So absolutely do not give up on this at all. It's really exciting to be talking to you about it all, because I mean, I really think this is something that people have got to get their heads around in workplaces up and down the country, just how big a threat this is, just how much that what's being proposed here is the exact opposite of some of the things Vote Leave promised back in that referendum. And we've got to get people protesting and on the streets about this. And I think we can, and I think we can win. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. Just before I get on with the questions, I just want to say thank you for all those who donated, those who sent their questions to me, donated, and for the speakers for their words of wisdom. Just to let you know, these are going to be ordered differently in the way that we're sent it in, because unfortunately a lot of these questions were very samey. And I want to get a nice variety of different sort of questions, because the same question would be very, very boring. So if you didn't answer in first, it might just be the fact that somebody also said the same question to me before, and we don't want the same answer 4 different times. Also, just for time, panelists, can you keep your answers to 2 minutes or less? Just because a lot of these are very open-ended, and I don't want to be here at like 9 o'clock. Okay, thanks. And so we'll get on with the first one, which actually is specifically to Ruth and Allison, actually. So that'll save some time. Allison talks about UNISON intentions to push back some provisions that are detrimental to workers' rights. How can the deal be amended since the Parliament has already voted on it, and moreover, now voted against their rights to scrutinise and approve any future trade deals? That's to both Ruth and Allison.
Well, I'll just go quickly. The trade deal hasn't finished the negotiations. Today, someone sent me this huge diagram showing, with a timeline showing that there's a lot more negotiations. The trade bill was only on goods. 80% of the UK's economy is services, and they've got to negotiate huge amounts still on services. So the pushback is that there is still space for us to lobby around any deregulations they tried to get through, for example. But also here, there's going to be an employment bill, for example. Now, we don't know why. Suddenly, we had a meeting with the cabinet, Roger Scully or something. I wasn't at it, so I've got this secondhand. But Francis O'Grady, and our General Secretary, went, and he said, he's from BIS in the Cabinet Office, that the employment bill, for example, is suddenly not going to be this year. It's getting pushed back. And the reason why we think they're pushing back such big bills like the employment bill is because they've still got to negotiate so much. And they're not going to put primary legislation through Parliament. And primary legislation, by the way, is you do get to have a say. You do get to try and make amendments. You can lobby your MPs. So there is scope for us to push back through trying to argue that we want all these things primary legislation. My biggest fear, though, going back to what Nick said, and then I will be quiet, was I did read today on Politico what the City of London is doing. And they really do want to deregulate everything, because the problem they've got is that the trade deal did not actually give them on a gold plate, which is what they wanted, complete adequacy. And there's a lot of barriers there. And a lot of European countries also don't want the City of London anymore to be the financial centre of Europe. And so there's going to be a massive battle going on. And in that battle, we've got to argue that we don't want this deregulations, because a lot of it's a loss of our digital rights. So it's going to be quite chaotic. And the government's trying to pretend the deal is done and dusted. It's completely not. And that's another battle that we've got to, explain to people as well.
Just to add to that, even if the deal was in kind of trade deal terms done and dusted, that doesn't mean you can't get back around the negotiating table. And we saw recently NAFTA was revised to produce, so the North American Free Trade Agreement was revised and became the US, Mexico and Canada agreement. And we did see some changes in there that were interesting. And something that we're doing now is thinking about how we set up Labour or maybe even the Green Party for the next election, so that when it comes to what the next government does, we have helped them develop some stuff that could improve the deal. And certainly post-election, I think there's more chance of going back to the deal and improving it.
Okay, thank you. The next question is for Emily. With the closure of the Committee for the Future Relationship with EU by the government, can we hold the government to account in other ways? And what can we do in the next few weeks and months to support that?
Thank you very much. I just want to add on to the previous discussion as well about the workers' rights, because I think it's helpful to think about the trade agreement with the EU in a way as giving us the right to deregulate. So that makes sense. If we stayed in the EU, we're really wedded to the EU model, which is relatively, in the world of trade agreements, are more stringent. And in a way, what we've done is move ourselves away. So we've now got the right to deregulate, hence all these initiatives to deregulate in our domestic agenda now. And I think, so therefore, pushing back on the domestic attempts to deregulate is really, really important. So engaging on the domestic moves, I think is probably one place to focus. Then the other is to think about the future trade agreements where we might be committing to a low regulation situation. Okay, so I think analytically that's quite a helpful distinction to make. On the questions of how do we hold the government to account, I think, so the EU committee I think it's not quite right, actually, that my phrasing of closing it down, its mandate has lapsed and they haven't renewed it. But the International Trade Committee in Parliament is going to be really important. But also making sure that other committees in Parliament properly scrutinise trade agreements. So what you see, for example, is the International Trade Committee's got MPs who are interested in trade. The digital, DCMS, Digital Culture, Media and Sports Committee, has got quite a lot of expertise on digital, but they don't necessarily look at trade agreements. Right, or the DEFRA committee or the Environment Committee. So it's getting other committees in Parliament to really realise that some of their policies are actually implicated in a trade agreement and getting them active and thinking about it and involved. So I think trying to widen the discussion, and the same outside of Parliament. Otherwise trade becomes this very niche issue that's only discussed by very few people behind closed doors. And actually there's a lot at stake, as I think we're all trying to explain. So I think in parliamentary questions, our MPs can always table written questions. So just the more that we're asking our MPs to ask questions, the more then the government has to sort of think things through and at least come out publicly to talk about it. So it's a way of sort of deepening, I guess, the democratic engagement in this space.
Thank you. The next one is for Nick. What do you think are the government's priorities for divergence from the EU standards? And given that there are so many fronts, how can we focus our energies effectively as campaigners?
Oh, well, that's a really good question. So from what we can tell, in terms of what, I mean, there is no trade strategy. Let's be clear about that. There's certainly not a public one anyway. And that indeed, that's one of the big problems. The government doesn't really say what it wants to do. It doesn't have any kind of mandates that spell out its program for its trade. It puts something on paper, but they're pretty poor, really. Unlike some of the stuff that we've been getting used to in the EU after many years of campaigning. But I would say big tech and artificial intelligence and all that kind of area of technology applied to different parts of our society, that's absolutely key for them. So I would definitely expect movement on GM. I would expect movement on food standards, actually, regardless of a US trade deal. And I would expect things around breaking away from GDPR, as people have said, and the kind of online privacy protections in the EU. I think that whole little bit, that whole chunk, is where they see Britain becoming a superpower. Although, given our test and trace system, you would wonder why they have that idea. But anyway, I think that's where they're going to want to deregulate. I think finance probably too, although they're having a bit of a struggle, funnily enough, on that one. Because when they talk to finance, and they did recently, they talked to the financial sector, well, what do you want? What do you want us to deregulate? Come on, it's all on the table. And finance kind of says, oh, we kind of preferred it in the single market, really. But I mean, that was the big financial corporations. I mean, and of course, the Tory party today is essentially driven by hedge fund money and investment fund money, a small number actually of extremely rich individuals who don't even really represent where British business is anymore, which is how a lot of us find ourselves in slightly strange rooms nowadays with business, as Ruth said, also saying we never get consulted or we're getting told off by the government for not being free market enough. So there is that kind of rather strange dynamic going on as well. But I think finance they do want, definitely. I mean, that's what their backers want, financial deregulation, so that we become the deregulated financial centre, not for the EU, but for emerging market economies and parts of the developing world, particularly. Including maybe even China, who knows, as well. And with that goes a lot of intellectual property provisions, which I won't go into a lot now, but this is another part of trade deals that, you know, is very, very relevant to us at the moment, because one of the other things we're working on is kind of vaccines and who has control over vaccines. And, you know, surprise, surprise, it's enormous corporations, some of them based here. And I think, again, intellectual property is going to be something that Britain wants to be a world leader in, which is seriously worrying stuff for developing countries.
Thank you. This next question is to all panelists. Emily asked us to stay engaged. How can she and the other speakers suggest that we can do this? What about engaging with organisations such as Another Europe is possible? Sorry, anyone can jump in on that.
Yeah, I'll just jump in. Obviously, we're a trade union and a membership organisation, so our policies are democratically decided through conference. And so we have broad areas, but our membership is engaged all the time and very much immediately have said we are pushing 100%, for example, for public services to stay public, no deregulation. Engaging members on technical things like trade is very difficult. And we have done some focus group work, for example, and what we found is they don't understand trade. So one of the things we have to do is to try and break down some of these ideas. Why is trade important to workers? I mean, when we did some focus group on Brexit, for example, the EU, it was quite amazing that some of our members just didn't even understand why we were worried about leaving the EU. So that gap has really, we've got a job trying to narrow that gap of understanding and how all this relates. A trade deal, something remote, relates to their everyday life. So we have to change the angle and actually talk about other things related to trade to get them to understand why it's important. What I think ways that we would do it would actually be doing more domestic campaigns for us in UNISON, but actually we are a global union, so we work for the Public Service International and we work with our European brothers and sisters trade unions. So there's global campaigns that we can all hook into, and that won't necessarily engage members here unless, for example, they are part of our international branches. We have international offices in every single branch in the UK.
The trade justice movement was set up as a network of organisations. We've got 60 members and we work with more organisations. And actually what's interesting is lots of organisations are now working on trade. So in terms of kind of active campaigning, Nick can say more about Global Justice Now's work, but Friends of the Earth are doing stuff. Keep Our NHS Public is really active on the NHS. The Open Rights Group do quite a lot of public campaigning on digital. There are loads of groups, and if you have a look on our website, there's a list of groups. We don't actually list active campaigns, I'm afraid, but you know, there's loads of them. Tradecraft, Fair Trade Foundation, ActionAid have got something specifically on gender, which is really interesting. You know, there's loads of stuff going on, so it's just a case of having a look at which organisations are out there. Even WWF, who haven't worked on trade before, they're also engaging. So lots going on in terms of kind of organisational campaigning, which is the bit I know about.
Well, it kind of relates back to the last question, which I failed to answer as well, on how do we focus. I mean, I think there's two sorts of campaigns. I mean, there's some campaigns where you're like, someone's got to stand up for this, even though we don't think there's much hope of winning it, but you've got to keep it on the agenda and start somewhere. And then there's campaigns, which I think, there's actually there's a possibility here of something, because there's disagreement in the government or the elite of this country or whatever. And I think the US trade deal in a way falls into that. I think some of the divisions in the people that were driving Brexit on this question makes it something that it's well worth fighting for. So, we make our own decisions about how we're going to, what issues we're going to take on that basis. I imagine, the food system is going to be really important to people on this call. I imagine workers' rights is also going to be really important. So those are two really key areas where I think, like Allison said, you don't have to talk endlessly about trade deals like we're doing here. You can talk about the things that trade deals are going to affect and make them the absolute center point of your campaign. You're still part of a trade campaign, but you're getting stuff across to people in a way that's a lot more difficult when you're talking about bits of the global political economy. And I think that's what we've been able to do through the US trade deal. And that's why we're going to keep very much focused on that, and encourage others to do as well. Someone mentioned Another Europe is Possible. So yeah, we're a founding member of that, and they're based in our office whenever we're in the office again. And so yeah, absolutely get involved in them. I think what they're doing at the moment is a lot of migrants' rights stuff, protecting the rights of people, EU citizens who are already here, and some of whom are now in a very difficult situation. But they're also doing a kind of Brexit watch thing, I believe, just setting up at the moment to try to monitor and fight against the bits of deregulation that are going on as they come out. And I'm sure, like us, they will get more involved in the ones that really gel with people, that are really compelling people to come out and do something. And that's kind of the way sometimes you choose campaigns, what works with people.
I'll just add my 2 cents in, and because having talked about parliamentary scrutiny, I do think engagement with MPs is useful, not least because the Conservative Party is not all behind. There's quite a wide spectrum in the Conservative Party, and I think a lot of them, more centrist Conservatives, are actually quite nervous about the agenda that's being put forward. So actually, the more questions we ask of our MPs, the more we ask MPs to really think through and consider the implications of trade agreements as they come up, the more they're going to have to sort of, I think, confront some of these issues a little bit more. And on that, I think it's really fascinating at the minute that bigger business is genuinely concerned as well. Partly out of a pragmatic perspective. I think they realise that if they're not upholding higher labour standards and high environmental standards, there's going to be a big public backlash. So at the moment, I think actually the deregulatory agenda, there's not huge numbers of people that are fully behind it. The issue is that that parliamentarians aren't necessarily engaged, they're not necessarily asking questions. So the more that we can engage broad swathes of Parliament, I think the more it puts this into the open. Just to echo what others have said, trade agreements are really abstract, legal, dense. So if you just focus on the issue that you care about, that you know about and can speak to, and then ask your MPs, how will this agreement or the CPTPP one that you're proposing to join, I care about the environment, how will it affect it? They're going to have to then go away and do some homework and ask some questions and respond to you, right? So again, it just linked to the issues that you care about. And I think that's probably the way to convince everybody else to get involved as well.
Okay, thank you. Just one final question, actually. I'll again go to Emily, because I think it's quite a good one to end on, which is, what does a good system of scrutiny and accountability look like?
Oh, how long have I got? Fancy. You don't want to be here till 9 o'clock, right? I think it's about everybody's perspectives being heard, right? So really thinking through, when you're thinking about a trade agreement, making sure that you've got the perspective of workers. So it's shocking there, right? Allison telling us that trade unions haven't been consulted at any point in time, right? So business is really frustrated. A lot of sectors of business that they're not being consulted, particularly smaller businesses. Right. Again, citizens' rights groups, so opening up and making sure we've got everybody's perspectives heard. And that's also about educating ourselves as consumer groups, as citizens groups, so that we can lobby. Because half of the problem is it's so technical and dense that only the biggest corporates have actually got the skills to get their head around the legal text. So part of it's opening up the processes of consultation, and part of it's making sure that once everyone's sitting at the table, they can articulate their interests vis-a-vis quite a dense legal text. And then the other thing I think is getting the parliamentary scrutiny engaged. And I'm happy to we can talk more, but probably not now, but in terms of just what models look like. But the European Union one has improved over time. So perhaps the only other thing to really emphasise is the need for transparency. So the European Commission over time is putting more and more documents in the public domain. So when it's putting trade proposals on the table, for example, with the United States, after a while it's now starting to publish them, it's publishing its negotiating objectives. The more we have in the public domain, the better. And again, this government's been very reluctant to put much information so far in the public domain.
Okay, and that's the final question. I just want to say thank you to the panelists that came today. I want to say a quick apology to Allison as well for that outburst. I'm sure she's used to it, but yeah, obviously it's not the way that we do things here at the with us. So I just want to say that. Also, I want to just give a quick shout out to the Young Greens, because they're helped a lot to put this together as well. So it wouldn't be right to not mention them, you know, putting this together as well. And I do apologize for all those who didn't get their questions asked, but as you know, these things, you know, it's 4 people, you know, 1 minute, 2 minute, it gets long and long and long and long. So I only could pick certain questions, and a lot of them were very long anyway. So I'd have spent 2 minutes just reading out the question, let alone you answering it as well. So like I said, I want to just thank everyone here as well for participating, and I want to see if Matt has anything else to say.
Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, Fancy said it all really. Thanks so much to all the speakers for coming and for everyone's questions. It's fantastic. Just very quickly, we have been recording this, and so a somewhat edited version, I think, will be uploaded to YouTube in due course. So if you want to revisit it, if you want to pass it over to your mates, your colleagues, your comrades, you will be able to do that. Finally, before we all go, I'm just going to drop a link in the Zoom chat now. That is a click to tweet link. So what happens when you click that is it will compose a tweet for you, and then you can send a tweet. So it's us putting words in your mouth. And what it'll say is, I've had a great time at this wonderful Green Party Trade Union Group event, and you should check them out and get involved with them. And it's a great way for us to reach new people online. So please do click that before you go. But yeah, that's all from me. So I'll pass back over to Fancy.
Just want to say once again, thank you for all coming here today, and just goodbye. That's it. We're all done. Let's go home. Well, you already are home, but yeah, let's say goodbye.
Thanks for chairing as well, and for Matthew and everybody. Bye.
Bye.